Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is Kim Beaudin, the National Vice Chief of the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples. First elected in 2016, Beaudin previously served as president of the Association of Métis and Non-Status Indians of Saskatchewan, formerly known as the Coalition of Aboriginal Peoples of Saskatchewan. National Vice Chief, thanks so much for being with us this week.
Well, thank you for having me.
You've long been an advocate for justice for Indigenous peoples. What's behind that passion?
Well, when I served as the Justice of the Peace for the province of Saskatchewan, I saw a lot of the there was a lot of issues that were coming out. It was like a revolving door for Indigenous people, and I really felt uncomfortable about it. It was like you hear all these policy changes within either the provinces or federal policy changes that just were not having the desired effect at all. That's how I became really passionate.
Yeah. When you were a Justice of the Peace, are there any stories or situations that stick out for you that have stayed with you all this time?
Well, what was really prevalent was the issue around remanding, and that was a big one. Like in terms of remanding Indigenous people, it was like a revolving door, and you realize that the administration process was stacked against Indigenous people. So a minor issue would become a major issue, and pretty soon you're spending 2 years in prison. Next thing you know, you're in the federal system, and a lot of the charges that I found were all administrative charges. Examples around people who couldn't address, or in terms of conditions that were put on them, and that was a big one, and that's where it really spirals out of control.
What are you most concerned about with the Canadian justice system currently?
I'm very concerned about the massive increase of Indigenous women. The Canadian government can't seem to get a handle on that. I'm very concerned about the issue around the overall, it's about 1% increase of Indigenous people federally incarcerated. And I'm also very concerned about what happens when our people are incarcerated in federal and provincial facilities. For example, there are suicides that are happening on a regular basis, and sexual assaults. You don't go to prison to be punished, and that's kind of what's going on. And I really fear, I get very concerned when people are sentenced federally that they might not come out. And that's pretty sad.
You mentioned the incarceration of Indigenous women. In your home province of Saskatchewan, the numbers are just mind-boggling, the number of Indigenous women incarcerated there. What's behind those numbers?
Well, that's a very good question. When I was doing the JP work at the time, it'd be over 10 years now, that wasn't really a huge issue. But then all of a sudden it began to balloon. And the federal government didn't approach it as a crisis, and that's exactly what it's become. And I'd really like to put my finger on it. I'm trying to understand what the changes. I know for sure that in terms of administrative changes within the justice system itself, the courts and all that have made a huge effect on Indigenous women, and it seems like there's like a target on them, and I really can't really put my hand on it or my finger on it why that's going on. It's something that we certainly need to address.
You speak about the ballooning of those numbers. One of the things we often hear is that the child welfare system is kind of a pipeline to the justice system. Is that something that you've noticed?
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah, it's definitely a pipeline. Once you age out, if you're struggling with addictions, for example, or housing, employment, these are all seeds for the police. Well, look about the number of people that they arrest if you're homeless. Look at the homeless caps all across Canada here, Vancouver, those kind of things. You know, East Hastings is a big one, Halifax. I mean, and the answer is to just arrest people, and most of those people are Indigenous people, and put them in provincial and federal facilities. That's their answer to homelessness. And so, yeah, I mean, those are two clear examples.
When one does a look at the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples website, a lot of the press releases in recent years have to do with justice or injustice. Why is this a file that CAP has taken on so much?
Well, what I find was that the people who were imprisoned in our jails and that didn't really have a voice, and I also begun to really understand that politically, organizations have abandoned them. Their bands that they came from, their communities. It's like when you get incarcerated or you're thrown in the justice system itself, you're really forgotten about. And you know, I really believe that we need to fight for everybody. You have people who are Section 35 rights holders, people who are treaty descendants. I don't understand. If you look in the treaties, it didn't say that we're going to incarcerate, you know, record numbers of Indigenous people and put them in federal prisons. I didn't see that in any treaties. I didn't see any agreements in terms of with the provinces as well, and they all play a major role. And so that's the reason why, you know, I decided to really focus on those things. The injustices that really come out in terms of Indigenous people is stunning. Some of the stories that I've heard, and I'll give you two examples of Odelia and Narissa Quazans, who will be going through a bail hearing after 31 years incarcerated and tied up in the justice system for a crime they never committed. And those are just two examples. We know that there are a number of other examples of women and Indigenous men as well who are federally incarcerated and been there for years and years, and nobody's fighting for them. And this is why our numbers are so high in this country, and why we need to change it. And Odelia and Narissa, you know, that's unbelievable. There's also been a push too in terms of provincial governments working on what they'll do is they'll focus on dangerous offender designations and long-term offender designations. And so basically, from a colonial perspective, they decided that they're going to throw away the key and keep Indigenous people locked up for the rest of their lives. And you know, and I mean, racism, it's very deep. It goes deep within the justice system itself. I know that's what it's based on, and Odelia and Narissa is one clear example of that. We've had how many? Three times now we've tried to get before the judge in terms of a bail hearing itself, and it's always been postponed and postponed. And then I find out, for example, the Saskatchewan government is opposed to their release. Well, how long do they want to keep them in prison for and keep them tied up in the justice system? Like, I don't get it. And that's why it's really frustrating.
Yeah, I did want to ask you about the Cuson sisters, Odelia and Narissa. APTN's been heavily involved in not only telling their stories, but fighting a publication ban. Can you tell us the importance of that case?
Well, it's very, very important. I really believe... that's how I got involved too as well. You know, you guys aired a story in terms of a documentary. And I was actually stunned when I watched it. And I'm thinking, well, why are these two women still in prison? They should have been out years ago. Well, again, you know, we're fighting a system that's broken. It works great for colonial governments and that, but it does not work well for Indigenous people. We need to be, as Indigenous people, we need to be more involved, intimately involved in everything. Policies, sitting on the parole board, all of it. Parole officers is another example. Our elders should be involved. I mean, I hear stories from elders that have actually been suspended because they speak up for Indigenous people in the parole system, for example, or if they go visit people that are incarcerated in our federal pens across Canada. These are the kind of things that I hear all the time, direct stories, and that's actually a story for another time. But it's unbelievable what's going on behind the scenes right now. I wish Canadians really knew. I really do. If they had a deeper understanding how the system is impacting our people across Canada, they'd be stunned.
Well, National Vice Chief, we're going to give you some more time to get that message out. We just have to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with the Vice Chief of the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, Kim Beaudin. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is the National Vice Chief of the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, Kim Beaudin. And Kim, before the break, we were talking about justice, but also about, in particular, the Cuson sisters. What does justice look like for Odelia and Narissa in your mind?
Well, I believe that come January, I believe it's the third week of January, the 2023, we'll be having a bail hearing at that time, and I believe that the courts will actually release them, and they will finally be able to go home. Now, mind you, that bail hearings till the federal government has their hearing, that's going to be a 2-year process. That it's going to take up to 2 years for the federal government to actually analyze what happened with respect to both of them, and whether there's been some injustices. Well, I've read a lot of information. I've read the documents from the courts from before, the proceedings, for example, and you can clearly see that something went off the deep end, and the two girls are unfortunately paying the price. And the other thing that bothers me too is these two, they've been tied up. I mean, they were in residential schools prior to that. So really, they've only seen freedom for maybe 5-10 years of their whole life, maybe not even that, of their whole life. And I don't understand how long they want to keep on, in terms of the federal, or particularly the provincial government, Saskatchewan government, how long they want to keep this going for. There's got to be accountability at some point. And the Saskatchewan government, they have to be accountable, they have to be answerable, and I'm hoping that's going to happen as time goes on.
Do you feel that CAP has been effective in pushing these justice issues?
Oh, certainly. I mean, one example, I'm a member of the National Advisory Committee for Correction Services Canada under, with Ann Kelly, Commissioner Ann Kelly. And, it took me a little bit to get on that committee. There's certainly a lot to learn. I'm learning more in terms of the inner workings of Correction Services Canada. The other one I'd really like to mention too is that I had an opportunity to attend parole hearings, and I attended a hearing in Prince Albert regarding Curtis McKenzie, who committed suicide in Correction Services in the Prince Albert Penitentiary. And one thing that really jumped out to me was that the kind of lack of accountability. We had a number of witnesses, like 28 witnesses, and only 2 of them were inmates, and they disappeared. Well, my direct knowledge, and I do get a lot of that, was that there were people that were there that they witnessed the whole thing, yet they weren't even called, and that wasn't very. I didn't like that at all. I wanted to hear what the inmates. There was only 2 of them, but they didn't really add a whole lot. I had more intimate information than actually some of them did myself, because I knew Curtis really well. And I mean, why would you commit suicide when you're like 3 months short of being released? These are the kind of things that go on every day in corrections. And so, yeah, I really believe that we can make a difference. I've been told numerous times, and with respect to that hearing, the lawyers for the inquest have said that they've never had an Indigenous organization actually show up in all the years they've been around. So, yeah, I really believe we can make a big difference.
You know, you mentioned we always hear about these new legislation changes and policies and all that. As somebody who's been directly involved with the system for decades, what would you like to see done to improve the justice system and Indigenous interactions with it?
Well, one thing that really jumps out to me as well is that there have been a number of policy changes. There's been changes that would have a direct effect on what's going on with respect to Indigenous people. But what I have noticed is that the bureaucrats, the officials that work within corrections, are not addressing those policy changes. So government, you know, they're making changes with respect, you know, in regards to legislation, for example, but it's not getting to the people who work, like wardens, for example, other staff. I mean, I don't know if you know this, but I mean, there's actually more staff working at federal institutes, Correction Services Canada, than there are inmates. Mm-hmm. And the budget's just, you know, like $3.2 billion a year, you know, and it keeps going up every year. That's a lot of money. Only 6% of that money reaches communities. And when I say that is that they only budget 6% to reach out to communities who address people who are getting out of prison, for example. That's not a lot of money, and you can't do a lot, especially when you spread it across Canada. One thing that's really important, I know that the federal government's working on a justice strategy, and I don't know what's going to happen there, but I really believe that if we put it in the hands of Indigenous people, our community organizations, we can make a huge difference. We can bring those numbers down. They can't. How far is it going to go? Are we going to be building more prisons and jails like they do in Ontario and like they are in Saskatchewan, where, you know, where their numbers, where they have more people and not enough beds, not enough cells, for example? It's crazy. And how much money are we going to continue to spend on this kind of stuff? I just can't figure that one out, when it's going to end.
Important questions for sure. National Vice Chief, yep. More to talk about here. We do just have to step aside for one more quick break, okay, and then we'll continue the conversation here with Kim Beaudin. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is the National Vice Chief of the Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, Kim Beaudin. And Kim, CAP was recently excluded by the federal government from being part of the National Council for Reconciliation. This is a council that was a TRC called action 7 years ago and meant to measure the success of reconciliation efforts. What are your thoughts on CAP being excluded?
Well, what's happened there is the federal government has chosen to disenfranchise over 1 million people living off reserve. And the majority of people that our communities work with are not connected to bands. They're not connected to Métis communities or Inuit communities for that matter. They live off reserve, and it's very important that our voices are heard. And to hear the frustrations, it's ongoing, and we believe that the Reconciliation Committee, our council, excuse me, is very important. We should have a voice there, and unfortunately the Liberal government doesn't see it that way.
What exactly happened? It appeared as though CAP would be involved and then was off the council all of a sudden. What happened there?
Well, we're pretty sure it's been political interference by other Indigenous organizations for some reason, and they have a policy called the distinction-based policy that they have. They've been talking about it for a number of years, and for some reason they seem to think that CAP does not fit within that distinction-based policy box that they created themselves, and I don't understand that. I mean, for example, myself, I mean, I have a treaty card. I'm a descendant of the Red River out of Winnipeg in Manitoba, on my father's side, and on my mother's side with a treaty card. I'm from a band that was enfranchised a number of years ago. There's a number of board members that sit with us that are all descendants, and they have treaty cards, and they're also Section 35 rights holders. I just don't get it. Where the perception that we don't represent anybody or that they don't know who we are is quite astonishing, actually.
Yeah, you know, CAP's been around for a long time, but over the years, Congress of Aboriginal Peoples seems to have gotten a bad rap, whether from other Indigenous organizations or from the feds. Is that something you would agree with?
Absolutely not. No, not at all. I mean, we know that there's organizations out there, Indigenous ones, really trying to demonize us for some reason. And historically, we've done some incredible things for our people. I mean, we fought for Bill C-31, for example. We're the ones that put Métis in the Constitution, and we're the ones that fought for Daniels with respect to non-status Indians and Métis across Canada. And this is the kind of things I don't understand. I was looking at when you looked at the case in terms of Daniels, and you reviewed it over and over. I did that quite a few times. You could really understand what was, in terms of what it meant for that ruling with a 9-0 run from the Supreme Court of Canada. 9-0 in our favor. And yet you have the federal government who chooses not to look at it and also sort of like bury it as history. So these are the kind of things that we're still trying to get our head around.
Yeah, National Vice Chief, why do you think that the CAP does get that treatment, and how do you reverse those attitudes?
Well, one of the things that we need to do for sure is we need to get out there in terms of telling our constituents, grassroots people really, what we're all about and who we fight for, and to ensure that they have a voice and to work with grassroots people across all our affiliates in Canada, and that's for sure that's the kind of things that we need to do in terms of prioritizing that. The other one too that I found quite interesting was that a number of the ministers, or not really ministers, but we'll say MPs, I'm going to use that as an example, they didn't really know a whole lot about CAP. They don't understand the history about CAP. They don't understand, like we've been around for 51 years now, going on 52, and it comes down to education as well. Our contributions to the history of Indigenous people in Canada, it is a very, very deep in terms of the history that we go to. So I don't understand it. I always assume, I guess you shouldn't assume anything, right? But I always thought that these MPs understood, especially if you have a file under Indigenous and then you find out somebody like Jamie Baptiste, who's the parliamentary secretary, doesn't even understand his file. And I thought he would understand who every organization is in Canada and who they represent, national, tribal councils, for example. But it's clear that he doesn't understand his file at all.
Well, especially when there's a former CAP national chief sitting in the Senate. National Vice Chief Beaudin, we have to leave it there. We're out of time.
Yes.
But thanks so much for doing the interview, and lots of work ahead in the new year.
All right. Yeah. Thank you very much for having me.
That is all the time we have for this week. We'll see you back here next week on Face to Face.